Assalamu alaikum. My name is Yusuf Ismail and the program you're watching is I Beg To Differ. This is a program which focuses on interactive debate on socio-political, religious and cultural issues affecting us as South Africans and certainly issues affecting the global community. In recent months, we've been hearing the scourge of ISIS in the South African context. Does South Africa face a terror threat from this particular movement and death cult which has been causing havoc globally? Well, joining me in the studios to discuss this particular topic, I'm joined by Maulana Rafiq Shah, who is the member of the KZN Provincial Legislature and an Islamic scholar and theologian. Welcome.
My pleasure.
We're also joined by a Skype by Jasmine Opperman, who is the Africa Director of TRAC. This is a terror monitoring outfit. Welcome to you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.
Let me start off with you, Maulana. We've heard recent reports in the newspaper about, particularly in the KZN context, we've had the recent reports about a series of arrests made by the Hawks. A group of 19 or 18 individuals that have been arrested. Bail was subsequently refused, and now, of course, the matter is before the courts. The issue that's going to be obviously on people's minds are, in the South African context, do we have the so-called phenomenon of ISIS basically permeating facets of South African society?
Well, Yusuf, without having to sound alarmist, I must admit that indeed we are vulnerable. And the reason I say we are vulnerable is because these events have happened. But I can't say that, I wouldn't be able to say that that this threat is a threat to the state, to the country as a whole, because
it's a very minority segment, basically.
Well,
you're looking at.
I mean, there is fertile ground in certain segments of the South African Muslim community. Everyone knows. I mean, you can take places like Roshni, etc., and there are many other places as well. We had the incidents where whole families had migrated to what they consider to be an ideal Islamic environment, the Islamic State in the Levant. And then subsequently we saw them come back home. Some of them have come back and others haven't. Then we had the case of the Tulsi twins. We had the case of the girl from Cape Town who was taken off the plane. And then this, and then what about the Northern Natal incident in which those two British
but very much isolated in the sense of you don't have the existence of a network. That's a point that I want to establish.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say that there isn't a cell. But what I would say is we have yet to see evidence that these operatives, if you want to call them that, are organized and that there's a command and control center here with a direct link to their counterparts, sitting in Syria or Iraq or elsewhere. So that has yet to be established. But the fact that they are here and that they speak in the name of ISIS, or rather they claim to be speaking, I think that they are more, inspired by ISIS. I think these are ISIS-inspired
as opposed to a chain of command.
As a change of command, or with direct instructions coming from a location somewhere in the Middle East. So my view is that yes, there is fertile ground for ISIS ideology here, that there are people who are inspired by it, that there are communities, certain segments, not the entire community, but segments of the community where
that may have some degree of sympathy towards the ideology. I think that's well. Let me bring in Jasmine. Jasmine, you are the Africa Director of TRAC. Now, TRAC involves in monitoring of purported extremist or terrorist outfits. Would you say, and certainly in the South African context, in the context of the news reports that we've seen over the past few weeks, and certainly since the attack on the mosque in April or March earlier this year, that a lot of these individuals are more specifically, if we could use the conventional term, operating as lone wolves, in the sense that there may be individuals that may possibly have some degree of sympathy to what ISIS, if you can call it that, stands for ideologically, but there's no direct nexus or chain of command that can be proven, in the sense that someone is getting instructions at the highest level from this outfit that operates allegedly in Iraq or Syria. These are basically individuals on their own mission, having perhaps some degree of extremist ideas, and then coming together as possibly a group, an isolated group. But this could be basically anyone on the road coming together and then saying, look, we are Al-Qaeda in Africa. But there's no actual chain of command that we see in many of these incidences.
I think if we start talking about South Africa, we must be very careful in terms of how we define the threat. I have written numerous articles over the preceding 3 to 4 years on our vulnerability to ISIS propaganda. The fact that we have families willing to move to the caliphate, those that have not been killed return. The fact that I'm involved in de-radicalization programs with some of the teenagers shows that there are people that is vulnerable to fall for their message. The problem we're sitting now with, and this is a court case that still has to move and prove its point, is that the message is that the Islamic State has moved into an organized manner, willing to execute attacks on home soil. Now that is a serious statement to make.
But where's the Jasmine? Just a quick point. Just to interject, Jasmine.
Available their modus operandi. Keep in mind that anyone can access Telegram, anyone can download training manuals on how to put a bomb together. And that does not necessarily say that they're ISIS loyalists or they support the extremist Takfir ideology. It simply means they're using their copy or their material to copycat.
Well, that's the point. Jasmine, I just need to interject just quickly. You speak about vulnerability to ISIS propaganda, obviously online, I would assume. And you speak about downloading of manuals, bomb making. That's the whole point that I want to establish, is that it becomes extremely easy in the scheme of things because of the public availability of these documents, of these items, for anyone to, for example, who supports this ideology, systematically download it and organize together, but to then call it an ISIS cell in the conventional sense, sort of indicate that there's some sort of nexus, when in reality, what you have is a kind of a case of these so-called lone wolves, lone wolves who probably may be inspired by ISIS ideology and then engage in attacks because the material is so readily available. So to suggest that there is a kind of a situation whereby ISIS at its headquarters, whether it's Baghdad or whoever, is now targeting South Africa or seeing South Africa as a base or a country within which to target, that's a bit far-fetched. Would you agree? And I'm going to come to you shortly, Maulana, but just on that particular point.
Our vulnerability lies at what I call the ISIS wannabe. Doesn't exactly understand the ideology, gets taken away by its ideology, decides to go out and execute some sort of attack.
Yes.
But I want to get back to the cell in Durban. If one looks at the modus operandi and the statements being made that there has been contact with ISIS people, the fundamental question to be answered is, who did they talk to? If they were talking to professional trained ISIS fighters, we would have seen far more serious consequences from the so-called bombings at Woolworths Spa in Durban.
And we haven't. I mean, they've been very amateurish.
Yeah, Yusuf, I'd like to come in here, Jasmine. Look, though we may not have as yet evidence to establish that there is a chain of command or there's a command center here, however, we cannot underestimate the fact that they manufactured incendiary devices,
sure,
that they managed to place them in public spaces, that they attacked a mosque and killed an individual, that the two British couple were murdered and their bodies dumped in the river, and all of these things that are happening. I shudder to imagine, had they been professional enough, if those incendiary devices were actually IEDs, functional IEDs, explosive devices, I shudder to imagine what the consequences would have been. So as much as we have not yet established, the case is still going on. We don't know what other kind of evidence might be revealed that ultimately might even do that. But My view is that I don't think the threat is to South Africa as a state, as a country. I think the fact that these devices did not do what they intended it to do shows that they haven't yet acquired that technological sophistication as yet. But the mere fact that they did it is a cause for concern. And if you also take into account that South Africa has very porous borders, okay, especially the Mozambique border, and the fact that they are, radicalized.
There have been incidences in Mozambique as well. I mean, there have been incidences in Mozambique recently.
Kenya, not far from here,
sure.
Nairobi, Tanzania, Somalia. Now, with the porous borders we have, what's to say that that professional elements would not be able to penetrate our borders and then link up with such elements like of the kind that we see now, and then this thing could really turn ugly. Now, I don't want to sound alarmist, but it is a reality that our borders are porous. Now, they haven't attacked South African infrastructure but the fact is that they have murdered individuals, both foreigners as well as South African.
Yeah.
And there seems also, I don't know if Jasmine will agree with me, some criminal elements to this entire episode.
Yeah, I think let's bring Jasmine in. I mean, that's one of the points here is that if you look at the report, certainly, there seems to be a case where one of the individuals, Farhad, who is a well-known, apparently he's a businessman in the area, was involving, accompanied with these so-called links, where he's apparently linked up to placing incendiary devices in public places. But there's elements of extortion, where businesses have been extorted, where kidnapping, for example. So how do you, for example, make the distinction between what can be ordinarily seen as a criminal act and what can be basically seen as ISIS-inspired ideology, or rather a combination of two? Because if we look at the facts behind us, we see a lot of attacks against businesses. We see in the city of Durban, just not too far away from us, burning of a particular business on the basis that monies were not paid. What would be the motivations ideologically if a lot of the actions seem to be conventional crimes like extortion, like kidnapping, and so on? What would the ideological motivations be if it is suggested that this is part of an ISIS cell or ISIS-inspired?
I think this is where the problem comes in, because we are working with a lot of assumptions. The fact that ISIS flags were found, the fact that there was training material from ISIS, does not tell me we are talking about committed ISIS loyalists, ISIS supporters, ISIS fighters. To the contrary, if I look at the way if one looks at the bombings, the say itself, and how it was done, goes contrary. And then also the Islamic State has simply not made any claim or any statement on Telegram regarding these activities. So that is my great concern here. What evidence? Secondly, the group that is being referred to, which one of the members had contact with, Dundala in Iran, does not exist anymore. They've changed their name. So we're sitting here with factual inaccuracies that needs to be specifically corrected in a court of law to prove that these people are ISIS fighters. Secondly, if one looks at the attacks at the mosques, horrific. Why do we need to put an ISIS blazer on it? If they want to create divide, religious divides, I can promise you, this is not the way an ISIS process or modus operandi will work. This is not the way they inspire local attacks in terms of Telegram material. And this is my concern in South Africa. The moment something happens, we have to bring in ISIS. But do we understand what ISIS stands for? Do we understand that South Africa's context is simply completely different to the Middle East, completely different to Europe, and it's simply not susceptible to such an extreme ideology, except for your few individuals. 75% of Islamic State attacks the preceding months were only in 4 countries.
Sure.
Now we're saying it's on South African soil.
I have to stop you there. Jasmine, I just have to stop you. I have to stop you there. And Molana, I just have to stop. We just have to go for a quick ad break. I do apologize for that. And we'll be back shortly. We'll be back. Well, welcome back to I Beg To Differ. I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail, and with me in the studios are Maulana Rafiq Shah and Jasmine Opperman from Track. We've been having some interesting discussion. Just to, I dealt with Jasmine just before we went for an ad break. You wanted to pick up on something critical that was raised by Jasmine.
I just wanted to pick up on the South African Muslim community perspective.
Yes.
You see, unlike the Middle East and other societies where Muslims are in a minority, we are fortunate that in our country we have a constitution. And the Constitution guarantees us freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of religious affiliation. And so by and large, the Muslim community in South Africa don't feel that they're being marginalized in a way. Because when people begin to feel marginalized and that they have been given a bad deal, then they find ways to express that anger, and then they are vulnerable to elements such as these extremist setups.
You just
what I'm trying to say is that in as much as the social media is being used by ISIS to project its vision, it's highly unlikely that it would find fertile ground to get support in the entire Muslim community. And that is why I'm arguing that it is only certain segments of the Muslim community who hold a particular theological perspective and worldview that they might find some space. But by and large, the Muslim community in South Africa are very well established in the country. They're quite happy with their lot. They find themselves
I just want to interject quickly. We seem to have lost earlier on the connection with Jasmine. Jasmine, are you back with us?
Just tell her
Are you back with us, Jasmine?
I'm back.
Yeah, sure. We just lost you shortly. You basically, I just want to interject on one issue, and I think you may have heard the gist. Maulana, it's just something that you want to, if you can summarize what you just said in just 30 seconds, what would be the crucial point that you would raise?
The crucial point I'm making is that radical elements and extremism always finds an excuse to project itself in a community. Now, for a community like South Africa, the Muslim community in South Africa are living under a constitution that gives them freedom of association, freedom of worship, freedom of affiliation, freedom of thought, all of those things. So they don't feel marginalized. So it's going to be very difficult for ISIS to
as a recruitment idea. And I just want to bring you up on that. I mean,
can I first stop you? Sure. There was something else that you raised earlier, and that was the issue of them kidnapping and attacking places of economic zones like
businesses and so on and stores.
Now recently when they raided one of the homes, they found a document. I think it's referred to as the Rumia or something like that, which gives directives.
It's actually a magazine of ISIS giving directives.
Attacking the economy of the so-called enemy.
Yeah.
So maybe that might
there could be some degree of link, but not so. But here's the point, Jasmine. I mean, from a constitutional point of view, one of the items found was apparently a flag, which has been appropriated by ISIS, but it's basically it has the classical declaration of faith affixed to a black flag, which is generally used by. So I'm saying generally, let's assume a person does support ISIS ideology, is to a certain extent inspired, at least from a mental point of view, without necessarily practically exemplifying the act, reads ISIS magazines, has extremist worldviews. That in itself is not a criminal offense, would I be correct? Because a lot of the state's case in this particular matter relies on the fact that a lot of the individuals and accused were found, for example, in possessions of the magazine Dabiq, which is one of the ISIS magazines. They were apparently linked up to a WhatsApp group called Jandullah. They were in possessions of alleged ISIS flags. Being in possessions of these items may possibly be incriminating in the long term, particularly pertaining to the case if the state wants to establish a nexus. But in a general sense, it's not a criminal offense. Would I be correct? Jasmine, are you there?
Yeah, if I heard you correctly in terms of the flag. Again, we're going back to the one people. We're going back to a person that plays around, sees the flag, gets a flag, but has absolutely no idea of actually what ISIS stands for, and then starts waving it to amplify the act. it does not make it a professional ISIS fighter, and I think that is very important. I believe if one looks at Fatima Patel, it's a classic case. We are seeing your typical wannabe ISIS person, and we must be careful. I think our big problem and big fear in South Africa now is we are linking ISIS to everything. We're sitting with consultants providing disinformation on the so-called presence of organized ISIS cells, which I have not seen in the 4 or 5 years I've been specifically looking at South Africa.
Why are they doing this, Jasmine? Why are they doing this?
And my question is, who is the hawks listening to? We need now sound, realistic analysis. Does this extreme idea really have found home in South Africa to this extent? We are going to cross the threshold in acts of violence? Highly unlikely.
Well, you know, Yusuf, I'm listening to what Jasmine is saying. Look, the overwhelming majority of theologians in this country, clerics, we call them imams or maulanas, ulama, they've condemned these acts. And the community itself, I mean, thinkers in our community, intellectuals, academics, everyone has, you know, with one voice, condemned this. So I'm pretty much sure that this will not become an acceptable phenomena within the Islamic community or the Muslim community in South Africa. But the only danger is whether these lone wolves, they are now lone wolves.
They're lone wolves, as it stands now,
they're inspired, they're lone wolves. But as I said earlier, that if they come into contact with the established eventually, or elements of, let's say, Al-Shabaab coming down from the East African coast into Mozambique, crosses our border, and because if you see the 11 people, for example, now that were arrested,
in court and arrested,
more than half of them were foreigners, right?
Tanzanian nationals.
The Delvicio matter, even Delvicio himself is not
a local South African, as I understand it.
And more than that, I mean, when I think about this, South African passports have been found in the possession of people who have conducted operations abroad. For example, let's look at Samantha, who Blue It or whatever her name was.
The so-called White Widow, the White Widow.
She had SA links. She remained in South Africa, in Fordsburg for some time. Now, these are professional people who came here. But I shudder.
But seeing this place as a base, then more than a place to launch attacks.
Maybe they look at South Africa as a safe haven to come and lay low for a while. Even, for example, I mean, we do know that there are elements in South Africa who would be willing to fund activities, you know, people with that kind of mentality.
Okay, just to interject then, what are you actually saying?
Yeah, no, I'm saying that these ISIS elements or other terrorist outfits, whoever they are, probably view South Africa, you know, the kind of freedoms we enjoy here.
The porous borders.
We have porous borders. Then obviously they look at South Africa as a country where we could come and lay low, or perhaps seek some funding from the Muslim community. They're very generous for various charitable, you know, under the guise of some charitable appeal. They could also collect funding.
Did you blame the South African government for the porous borders, for the lack of security?
I certainly would. I would certainly call on the South African government, you know, to ensure that it strengthens its border control mechanisms out there. And everybody knows the situation at the Department of Home Affairs. People bribe their way. I mean, how could those people have acquired South African passports? How could Samantha have acquired South African passport? Ask yourself. And there's 2 or 3 other people that were involved that also had South African passports in Britain.
Who takes the blame then? Who takes the blame? Department of Home Affairs.
Department of Home Affairs, because of the corruption. You know, how else could they have acquired South African passports in the name of some other South African? If it was not. So
there is an element of corruption.
Yeah, it is. So I think we need to tighten up that security.
So Jasmine, porous borders, are they a factor in all of this? Jasmine, are you there?
Just repeat the question.
I just said, as Maulana alluded to, corruption within the Department of Home Affairs, existence of porous borders, lack of security at border controls. Are these all factors that South Africa, in a sense, becomes a safe haven for extremist individuals or networks?
Oh, yeah. I would agree completely with that statement. I think we have numerous examples of that. I want to refer to a specific example. I'm not going to mention the name as I'm not sure there's an investigation going on. A Canadian Islamic State fighter that is now fortunately in prison in Canada, that actually was in South Africa, visiting a very specific mosque in the Malaysia area. And where he was exposed to Islamic State propaganda, not necessarily at the mosque. Please, let's be clear on that. But he was in South Africa and he traveled. Samantha, we know about. So there are numerous cases where our border control measures have been exposed in terms of picking up and relying on Interpol to be able to be effective.
Just a quick point, Jasmine. In terms of role of justification, I've got a report by psychologist Mark Sageman. He's worked with the Mujahideen in the 1980s. He, in fact, engaged with them, particularly. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, had a lot to do with the 9/11 Commission report that was done in after 2001. This is what he says in an interview and a discussion he had with Mahdi Hassan. He says, in relation to ISIS members or people who may either directly be connected with ISIS, with the chain of command, or alternatively inspired. This is what he says. He says religion has a role of justification, but it's a role of justification. It's not why they do this or why young people go there. He says ISIS members, or in many instances, obviously extending to lone wolves, are using religion to advance a political vision rather than using politics to advance a religious vision. To give themselves a bit more legitimacy, they use Islam as a justification. However, it's not about religion, it's about identity. You identify with victims, with the guys being killed by your enemies. So in many instances you find an appropriation, legitimate appropriation, but an illegitimate appropriation of political grievances. And this is used as a basis to cite their then exclusive membership or inspiration in terms of supporting this ideology. Would you agree with that? That is a key factor as opposed to the Islamic worldview or the Quranic text, for that matter, which provides a motivating role for recruitment and subsequently joining these factions?
Oh, definitely. I think one must just be very clear. The Islamic State misuse and abuse of Islam, the way they use hadiths to justify the ideology as Al-Qaeda, highly selective and not representative of Islam at all. Yeah. The fact of the matter is we are sitting with situations of policy failures by the Western world in the Middle East, at home as well. Yep. We are sitting with people sitting in front of their TV sets and see what is happening to Muslim communities and how they are being exposed to vulnerabilities, socioeconomic deprivation. And these frustrations do crop up and create a perception of a world divided and that they want to play a role.
Yeah,
ISIS.
Yeah, Jasmine, you're quite right. You're quite right.
The greater Sunni community. If they have 2% support, they would be lucky. But for the person vulnerable to the propaganda, these realities do not matter. It becomes an emotional aspect. Yeah. And that emotional aspect starts driving actions.
Okay. Jasmine, just one point. Malana, I just want to come back to you on this, but I'm going to come back to you shortly, Jasmine. I mean, just on the point that you said, foreign policy, legitimate political grievances.
I want to say this. The inspiration is twofold.
Yeah.
Geopolitics, and extremist, virulent strains of Islamic theology. They both converge. If a person, as she said, is watching the atrocities being committed, let's say in the Middle East, the invasion of Iraq, the bombings, the issue of Palestine, and the silence of the West in trying to bring about a just solution to the problem. When a young mind sees all of that, it's quite easy to be influenced by a strain of an Islamic theology that speaks about the other as the enemy and presents these atrocities as these are the enemy.
Which is what Al-Qaeda did. I mean,
exactly.
Bin Laden, before we go for the ad break, Bin Laden himself, if you look at most of his speeches, very rarely does he coach it. Well, certainly there may be references to certain Islamic passages in the Quran, but generally speaking, his motivating factor, again, misappropriation of legitimate political grievances.
Exactly.
And I think that seems to be the kind of the trajectory in which we're all these particular movements. Well, I'm just going to stop you there, Maulana. We have to go for a quick ad break and pay our bills, unfortunately. And we'll be back shortly, coming back to this interesting discussion. Welcome back to our Beg To Differ, and we involved in a clinical discussion and debate. Well, we can't say debate. We all seem to be in agreement on the general issue of ISIS President. Just before we went for an ad break, there's something I wanted to raise with you, the role of the mosque in the South African context. Now, you know, when you look at a lot of these analyses that are basically being conducted, the general assertion is that people get radicalized, not in the mosque, but online, in the bedroom, in the darkest recesses of their room. Now, Maulana, just to clarify that, does the role of does a mosque have a strong role to play in terms of curbing this ideology, or do the youth feel that the kind of inherent conservatism that they see is, if I can crudely put it, a turn off, and so therefore they become more susceptible and amenable to extremist recruits, which seems somewhat adventurous, and they've got this kind of nostalgic notion that basically permeates the youngsters.
Well, look, the reality in South Africa, well, as we know, ideally...
You're a theologian, your mosque particularly.
Obviously. Ideally, in a country such as ours, in South Africa, where we form a minority, I would imagine that ideally the mosque ought to be playing a more critical role in developing social cohesion in the country, developing understanding between Muslims and non-Muslims.
Does it not?
Well, it's not done enough, and that's the problem. Now, the fact of the matter is that there are, I'm not saying all mosques, but there are certain scholars and certain imams in our country who do not see the damage that they cause to the Islamic image, which ultimately then leads to Islamophobia and misconceptions about Islam.
Through inflammatory rhetoric, basically.
Inflammatory rhetoric, hate speech. There are individuals, I'm not going to take names, for example. So when you see communities being divided, and where radical imams make radical Islamic rhetoric, fermenting divisions against the other, the absolutist idea that I am the proper Muslim, I am the only Muslim, our ideology is the only one, and the other is an enemy because they don't agree. Now, we do have those elements, make no mistake, but they are... It's a minority, but they ferment divisions within, which creates a fertile ground.
But a lot of these extremists, even the leaders, do not necessarily have a theological background. I mean, generally speaking, and I've been involved personally in debates on these issues with a number of people you can describe as Islamophobes, Robert Spencer, Osama Dagduk, and so on. The general so-called, you see, here's a problem that I have. The far right, the extreme right, and those who are actually within this extremist framework basically play off each other, because those within the extremist framework somehow believe that there's some degree of religious justification for this. And those on the extreme right, or who are basically champions of the Islamophobic industry, also agree with them, but their view is, yes, you are doing this because of your religion teaches you this. So it's a kind of a schizophrenic relationship in the sense that they kind of agree, they're both in agreement. If you look at someone like Robert Spencer, Pamela Geller, far-right members in the United States, they are in fact in agreement with, in many instances, Bin Laden or Baghdadi if he existed, and so on. So they cannot, my whole point here, Maulana, is that, and you're a theologian, can you make a cogent religious case, or do you have to resort to atomization of scripture, twisting scripture out of context in order to justify an extremist ideology?
Well, look, all they need is an excuse. You don't have to be an academic to know that. All you need is an excuse. You have an objective, it could be a political objective, all you need is an excuse. And then you see they resort to making references to verses of the Holy Quran which speaks about, let's say, violence.
Surah 9 verse 5, Surah 9:29, whatever the case is.
And remove it from its historical context, for example.
Sure.
But they wouldn't say things like the Quran says, Kana nas ummatan wahida, that the whole of humanity are actually one ummah, one community. Or for example, when the Quran says, Laqad karramna bani Adam, that
all the children of Adam.
Adam are worthy of reverence and respect merely by virtue of being humans.
Sure.
They won't speak about that. They won't speak about وَإِنْ أَحَدٍ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ إِسْتَجَارَكَ فَأَجِرْهُ حَتَّى يَسْمَعُ كَلَامَ اللَّهِ. That if an idolater or polytheist or mushrik comes to you seeking your protection, then grant that person a protection. Here's the Quran advocating protecting a vulnerable polytheist, for example. They won't speak about this universal role that a Muslim has.
Or the universalist tone of the Quran.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's the whole point, is that they resort to divergent, selected verses, but again, taken out of the historical context.
Exactly.
Surah 9 verse 5 was in the context of the breaking of the treaty by the polytheists in the Meccan context.
Exactly.
Taking out of context, you apply it in the 21st century, out of context and divorced from its historical perspective, you then basically mutilate faith. And this is the point, Jasmine. I mean, if you look at the rise of ISIS, in a sense, and ISIS and Al-Qaeda, you can extend it perhaps to Taliban extremist factions in Iraq, for example, in Syria. It's actually been a disaster for the public image of Islam, and basically a boon for the Islamophobia industry. It's been a boon for the far right because it plays directly into the stereotypical narrative. So for example, you've got people like Robert Spencer, you've got Daniel Pipes, you've got Pamela Geller. You know, there was a recent attack that happened in the United States in Florida, the attack on the synagogue, a far-right member. Most of these Islamophobic websites, like Jihad Watch and so on, that generally focus on extremist activity, did not cover that event because it did not play into the narrative that in fact it was a Muslim extremist, or it was Islam that was behind this attack, or Islamist terrorism. And so generally, all the rise of ISIS, in a sense, has been a boon for the Islamophobia industry.
Exactly.
Who benefits? They benefit in the long term. The far right has benefited because it plays into the narrative. I'll come to you. I just want. So can you comment on that, Jasmine?
I think what is important to understand when we start talking about extremist groups is that no matter what the ideology is, there are usually three trends present. One is that they create themselves as representing a specific group. Two, that they are confronted by an enemy that can only be destroyed by violence. And three, their whole vision of the end of time. There will have to be a drastic change of the system. If it's religious motivated, it doesn't matter if it's a Christian extremism or Islamist extremism, there's always an end of time theory. And then there's this whole narrative that's built around it, this conspiracy theory, to call it at best. And this narrative sadly finds home.
But Yusuf, you know, who sustains, Jasmine, who sustains this false narrative, for example? The media.
The mainstream media
needs to act more responsibly. Because when acts of terrorism, let's say for example,
the Ku Klux Klan,
even if it's like in America, for example, right? Even if it was a lone wolf, a guy takes a gun, goes into a school and kills, over 50, 60 people, that's not looked upon as Christian terrorist or terrorism. And so one would question why, when a Muslim person or an organization conducts an operation, for example, that it is always termed Islamic terrorism. We know that terrorism is terrorism, period. Terrorism knows no religion. Terrorism is terrorism, and there can be no excuse for that. So I think the media needs to act more responsibly when it reports on these matters, and not focus too much on the religion of a person, but focus on what the person has done.
I think I would like to come in there and support the other guest speaker. I mean, we sit with practical examples now in the US. The moment there's a shooting incident and a white person involved, it's being called an active shooter. But the moment a Muslim is involved, he's immediately jumped to the conclusion of being a terrorist.
Jasmine, here's the issue.
This is the concern, and this is where the media has such an important role now in South Africa.
This is primarily the issue.
Cell as ISIS.
Jasmine, this is the issue.
This is an ISIS cell. It's sensationalism.
Jasmine, I agree with you. I agree with you. Jasmine, just on this point here, and in a broader sense, I understand the point you made on whether this is an ISIS cell. It doesn't seem to have remnants of an ISIS cell. But this is a point, just to extend the argument further. Why is it when we look at elements like the Ku Klux Klan, Anders Breivik, for example, in Norway, who had the Crusader outfit, went to shoot people, the Lord's Resistance Army in Africa, many other factions, probably from the Christian South, Tamil Tigers of Elam. Why is it that all these groups, all these movements are viewed as an aberration, in the broader religious framework? Burmese Buddhists killing the Rohingya, they are viewed as an aberration, not normative of Buddhism. Whenever it comes to extremism or extremist elements within the Islamic world, this is viewed as fundamentally normative. And I think, why is this the case? Is this possibly because of the fact that at some level you've got people with certain ulterior motives, certain ulterior agendas, or is the media just simply out there to maintain this level of duplicity, double standards, inconsistency? What's the rationale behind this? Why can ISIS not be seen as a death cult for what it is, just like the Ku Klux Klan is seen as an aberration, just like the Lord's Resistance Army is not seen as normative of Christianity, or Anders Breivik was not seen as a true Christian? Why is this distinction never made?
And I think the irony is that the media is then playing exactly into the hands of these extremist groups, because they create the divide, they create the fear, they create the perceptions, which is not based on factual evidence. And that is my fundamental concern now with the case in Durban. We are calling this ISIS over and over and over again, irrespective of any evidence. Let's look at the Tulsi case, if I can bring that in. 30 times being postponed. 30 times, yet they're already being condemned as terrorists.
So there's a lack of investigation within the Department of Justice.
I think, and I've said that at the AMEC conference this week, that another concern is our law and order departments, our security sector. Do they really understand what ISIS is all about? You cannot look at ISIS in isolation in South Africa. Do they understand the international phenomena? If they are not tracking Telegram and they are not listening to their voices and what they are saying and how they're communicating, they will never be able to understand the threat it poses to South Africa.
Jasmine and Molana, I just have to stop you. We have to go for a quick ad break. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to our Beg to Differ, and if you just joined us, we're having an interesting discussion on the whole role of ISIS, and certainly in the South African context. And with me in the studios have been for a quarter of an hour, Molana Rafiksha and Jasmine Opperman. Jasmine, just before I went to the break, I just want to ask you a question. TRAC, you the director, the Africa director of TRAC, you certainly monitor individuals who purportedly leave the country and possibly join extremist factions. Would I be correct?
That's correct, yes.
Now here's the situation, the other side of the coin, the contrary side of the coin. There are a number of individuals within the Jewish community that go on the Israeli kibbutz that in many instances are found to join the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, and many Jewish factions. Does TRAC do an equivalent monitoring of members of the Jewish community?
Yes, I think if I can use a practical example.
Because that's a criminal act as well.
Kidnapping specifically, not that I'm a kidnapping expert, but if one looks at people going to Pakistan as a case in point, what you find in these cases generally is that indeed where there is radicalization taking place and they do return to South Africa, that the grievance, and I think that's the important factor, the grievance is not then directed against South Africa, but what support they can give to specific groups in Pakistan with their extremist ideas. So it is the bringing back of extremism, but projecting it back to where they have actually been radicalized.
Okay, but Jasmine, just to interject,
against South Africa, and that is so important to understand.
Just to interject, Jasmine, I understand you raised the issue of Pakistan, but particularly the Jewish community. There are a large number of Jewish boys and girls that are going on a kibbutz, and in many instances you find Jewish members, South African citizens, criminally and illegally are going and fighting and joining the Israeli Defense Force. Does TRAC monitor these individuals? And why is there not much of a kind of an uproar surrounding individuals joining the IDF, as you find concern and consternation of individuals joining ISIS? Why is the same level of concern not exhibited to someone, for example, that, I mean, when you talk about terrorism, there's state terrorism, there's individual acts of terrorism. So if Jewish individuals join the IDF, why is the same level of concern not exhibited towards them as you find the concern exhibited to individuals who may join ISIS or Al-Qaeda and other groups?
It's a valid point being raised. I think it's something that cannot be disputed, and it serves as an equal priority in terms of countering such type of acts of violence by state themselves and governments themselves. The problem we're finding, and I think it is such a sensitive issue in so many states, that there are simply too few people trying to expose and bring these people to account. And I think, and that is also what is happening with those people specializing specifically in that area in TRAC, in terms of the American foreign policy. That is completely one-sided in this matter.
No, just on that particular point, I mean, this is certainly a concern that people have had. That on the one hand, we do have this concern, but on the other hand, the Israeli state, or states, for example, that engage in terror, equally should be this degree of concern and consternation in the public where you find this level of joining and recruitment taking place.
Yeah, I think people in our community have been actually raising this matter. The state does have, we do have, legislation that actually governs these kind of activities where a South African citizen is not allowed to go and participate.
We've never seen the criminalization of that, by the way.
Yeah,
we've never seen the criminalization of that.
We haven't seen that happen, but that, I think that could be a failure on the part of the state to actually implement legislation that we have actually formulated.
Yeah. As a theologian, and certainly I would assume that you've got the platform, people like you have a significant responsibility.
One cannot underestimate the influence that Islamic theologians and ulama and imams have.
How do you break down this ideology? How can someone like you, how can the imam break down this ideology, which is fundamentally rotten at its core, no legitimate religious basis, and cannot even justify it appropriately from the Quranic point of view?
Well, I think it's about education. It's about where have you been oriented? Which institution did you attend? Who were your shuyukh? Who were your teachers?
Broadening the ambit of the discourse. I mean, broadening the ambit of the discourse in the mosque in South Africa, is that certainly a role, the kind of openness?
Well, it's an open secret. The mosques in South Africa either belong to this or that sect, and that's a reality. Now, when this incident took place in Ottawa, what was happening prior to that? Okay, there was outrage. There were ulama who visited the mosque and sympathized. There were ulama scholars who condemned it. But I'm saying we need to hear more voices. What was happening before this? Before this, there were mosques that were openly preaching hatred against, for example, the Shiite community. I'm just using that as an example. But this kind of hate speech is not common in all the mosques, but certainly there are ulama who actually do that. So I would say to them that they must exercise their platforms and the responsibility, I mean, their positions with responsibility.
You mentioned hate speech. I mean, how do we define hate speech? Because sometimes maybe providing legitimate critique against a sect that you may disagree with? Is that hate speech? There are certain defining aspects because of freedom.
We should be guided by Quranic precepts, right? When the Quran says, La ikrah fi din,
let there be no compulsion
there is no
in
compulsion
matters of
in
faith.
religion. What that actually says is that people have a right to disagree. Now, you can have a right to disagree, you can be disagreeable, but it should not be taken to a level where you want to demonize the other to an extent that you open the avenue for violence against that individual. You know, so I think that to a large extent, for some time now, before this incident happened at the Ottawa or the Verulam Mosque, there was this degree of hate speech that was directed against that particular sect or community. Now, what we need to do is actually preach tolerance, understanding, respect for differing views.
A more Quranically centered society, which is pluralistic in nature.
Exactly. And then we live in South Africa.
Multiculturalism. I mean, that's
pluralism.
Opening the mosques to, for example, the non-Muslim public. I mean, we've had, for example, the Open Mosque Day.
Those were good initiatives.
The Islamic Propagation Center for more than 5 decades has opened the mosque.
That's an excellent initiative because it gives other religious communities in South Africa a deeper insight to us as a community, our worship, our culture, who we are as a people. That creates understanding and it contributes
and social cohesion as well.
To the larger agenda of social cohesion. So my appeal to the ulama in our country would be to respect, and we have a constitution that it gives us freedom of expression, but freedom of expression cannot be unbridled. It has to be exercised with a degree of responsibility.
Okay, Jasmine, if there's, I mean, from your magic ball, I mean, it's difficult to obviously speculate, and certainly with the case that's sub judice in our courts. But if there's something that you as a monitoring outfit would advise the South African government or the community in public in respect of the kind of nexus or connection or recruitment of individuals, what would your advice be?
I think at the end of the day, if I had to give advice, is first of all, you cannot give advice if you do not understand. Make sure you understand these narratives, make sure you understand how they work, make sure you understand why people fall for these narratives, and make sure you have a soft approach in place whereby you can assist and help those falling for the propaganda instead of merely looking at a court case, incarceration. Your soft power strategy is of equal importance in countering and creating channels of cooperation with communities.
And on that note,
and that one last minute, yes, certainly.
I think it would be equally important, Jasmine, to see how the South African government would reintegrate those who are returning from ISIS territory, whether they are, if they're going to be monitored, debriefed, or because obviously there will be concerns whether these people have come back solely because they regret having gone there in the first place, they made a mistake, for example, but there would always be that suspicion that whether they've not come back according to a plan, to come back here and actually carry out some kind of operation. So I think it will be crucial how the South African government, and I want to focus on what you talked about, the soft approach. But then the other side of the point would be people would argue, well, if you're going to be soft on people who went there, and then that's just going to be like inspiring others. No, you can go there, do what you like, you can come back, you'd be welcome with open arms. So I think there'll have to be a balance here on a case-to-case basis after having debriefed people, because obviously we would like to reintegrate people back into normal life and normal society, because if they acknowledge that they have done a mistake, they don't identify with that philosophy and ideology anymore, then I would hope that they would be given an opportunity to come back to normal life. So I think there's that line, that balance.
Thin line, the balance that
which the government will have to focus on.
Absolutely. Well, Jasmine Opperman, I want to thank you for this fruitful engagement. Maulana Rafiq Shah, thank you very much. We hope to have you both again at some point in the near future. And thank you to the viewer. You've been watching I Beg to Differ. This is a program which focuses on interactive debate on socio-political, religious and cultural issues. And today we looked at the scourge of ISIS in the South African context. Join us next week for more hard-hitting debate on I Beg to Differ. Till next time, this is Yusuf Ismail on behalf of ITV. Assalamu alaikum.